So good morning, everybody, and welcome to this live webinar on regulatory affairs and medical devices. My name is Paul Freeland, and I'm Director of Quality and Compliance, and I'm joined by Jan, who will help with the questions and answers at the end of this live presentation. Our objectives for this morning is firstly to introduce a little bit to EU legislation which relates to our products, and then with a particular focus on the medical device regulation, look at PHC's strategy and some of the implications that this will bring in terms of changes to labelling and declarations of conformity and so on, and how it affects the product line. And as I mentioned, at the end of the presentation, we'll answer questions, any questions that you have. And those questions can be submitted already now online to Jan, and Jan will look through them as we go through. Firstly, I want to talk a little bit about EU legislation in general, and that will help with my explanations on medical devices. And I imagine many of you are already familiar with some of the terminology that I'll explain, but if not, hopefully this is useful for you. So let's first look at the type of legislation that applies to our products that we sell. And there are two essential types. We have regulations and we have directives. And you'll have heard of things like the F-gas regulation or the low voltage directive. So what's the difference? Well, a regulation is binding and it must be applied in its entirety across the whole of the EU. And this is more of the direction in which the EU is heading, so that there is uniformity across the whole of the single market. Whereas with directives, this sets out a goal that all European countries, EU countries, must achieve. However, it's up to the individual countries to devise their own laws to reach these goals. And a good example of this is the low voltage directive. But we've also had the medical device directive, and to illustrate how this works, for example, in some countries, the governments require manufacturers to register their products as medical devices, whereas in other countries they don't. And that's an example of how each individual country devises their own laws for a particular directive. So we're talking about regulations and directives. So how does this EU legislation apply to PHCBI products? Well, essentially, there are two underlying objectives for most EU legislation. One is to protect the safety of the public, whether that's as an operator or a user of equipment, or in the case of medical devices, as a patient being connected to that device. The other area that applies to our products is in the area of environmental protection. So clearly, articles such as refrigerant gases or the hydrogen peroxide in our H2O2 solution can have an environmental impact if it's not handled correctly. And as you can see by the legislation that's highlighted in red, legislation can have multiple objectives. So in the case of REACH and CLP, which relates to the registration and evaluation and authorization of chemicals and the chemical labeling and packaging, that has both a safety element to it to protect the users that they don't get burned from acids, etc., and also an environmental element so that you don't throw hazardous chemicals down the drain pipe to contaminate the water source. So that's the type of legislation which applies to our products. The next thing I want to talk about briefly is about how manufacturers such as PHC go about complying with this EU legislation. And essentially there are two ways in which PHC does this, and it's determined by the type of the legislation. So some legislation, again like the low voltage directive, allows manufacturers to conduct a self-assessment. So basically it's do it yourself, confirming that your products comply with the necessary legislation. The other route that is used is through a notified body. So this is an authorized organization which can support manufacturers with their conformity assessment. And some legislation actually requires manufacturers to do this, and it tends to be the higher risk ones, like the Medical Device Directive, where a manufacturer has to involve a notified body to support the assessment procedure. And our notified body is PHCBI. So that explains a little bit about the conformity assessment route, so how we determine that our products comply with the regulations. The other thing I want to just talk about a little bit, because this will relate to what we discuss later on medical devices, is many legislative acts require manufacturers to draw up a declaration of conformity as well as to CE mark their products. So that's something that we're all very familiar with, is the CE mark. If we go through the self-assessment route, where we basically do it ourselves, the way in which manufacturers mostly determine conformity is by applying what we call harmonized standards. So basically in the directive, like the low voltage directive, it will list out the standards that manufacturers can use to conform conformity to their products to the regulation. So for example, in the case of the MIR 154, here we're saying that the product complies with the following EU legislation. So this is the low voltage directive, the EMC directive, and also the Roche directive on restricting hazardous substances in electrical equipment. It lists out the harmonized standards that we've used to conform to those requirements. And the most sort of well-known of these is what's called EN 61010, which is the safety standards specifically for laboratory equipment. And that's how so the factory tests the products against this standard to confirm that the electrical risks that are acceptable and also the mechanical risks as well. Okay. So that's a declaration of conformity for a product that we have self-assessed using harmonized standards. And the other elements of the declaration of conformity include the manufacturer's name and address, the object of the declaration, for example, the model number, the trademark, and the serial number from which it applies. So if there's ever a very significant change to the product, that might require the issuing of a new directive, declaration of conformity, and that would be issued, and then we would upload that to our product portal so you can access the latest version. Also, which is not shown here, is the manufacturer's signature and also the authorized representative, which I'll talk about later. So this is a declaration of conformity for a product that has gone through the notified body route of conformity assessment. And here we've got the MCO 170 AIC series, which is a medical device. And here it shows conformity to the Medical Device Directive, and the conformity classification that is applicable. And also, rather than showing notified harmonized standards, it shows the notified body that we've used. And as I mentioned before, that is PHCBI, and it's indicated with the CE mark, but also the indication number of the notified body, which is 0123 in the case of PHCBI. So if you ever see a declaration of conformity or a CE mark on a product with a different number here, that would indicate that the manufacturer has used a different notified body. Right, the next thing I want to look at is the term called economic operators. So EU legislation actually defines the different economic operators that are involved in the supply chain of the product and their obligations under the directive or the regulation. In the past, most of the, if not all of the responsibilities rested on the manufacturer, but the EU realized that many manufacturers are based outside of the EU, and it would be appropriate that organizations, companies within the EU who are importing the product onto the single market should also share some of the burden and the responsibility of ensuring that only safe products are reaching customers. So it defines specific operators who are involved in that supply chain. So the manufacturer is clearly the organization that produces a product by itself or has that product made for it or designed for it under its own name or trademark. So clearly, in respect to PHCBI products, the manufacturer is PHC Corporation in Japan. They can, if they wanted to, subcontract manufacturing to another legal entity, but because the product is marketed under the PHCBI name, PHC Corporation remains the manufacturer. Often you'll hear the term legal manufacturer as well. Yeah? The next player is the authorized representative. So basically, an authorized representative is a person or an organization which is established within the European Union that has received a written mandate or agreement from that manufacturer to act on its behalf in relation to specific regulatory tasks. And some directives and regulations actually require the manufacturer, if it's based outside of the EU, to appoint an authorized representative. So again, in the example of the PHCBI products, PHC Europe BV is the authorized representative of PHC in Japan. And the reason why this is important is that if you can imagine there was a serious incident or a product recall, then the European Union authorities want to be able to deal with an entity based in the EU in a convenient way. So we have an agreement with PHC in Japan that should there be some reportable incident or recall, hopefully that will never be the case, but if there was to be one, then the European authorities could deal directly with us in Europe rather than having to deal with an entity in Japan with all the complications related to time difference and possibly language as well. So that's our role. We have an agreement with PHC that we will fulfill specific tasks should that be necessary. The other operators in the supply chain are the importer and the distributor. An importer is the organization established within the EU who places products from a third country onto the union market for the first time. So when we bring products into the EU through Rotterdam, once that product has cleared all the customs procedures, then that is now in free circulation within the European Union, and PH Europe is the party responsible for doing that. Then we have the distributor, and the distributor, as the name suggests, is any other organization other than the manufacturer or the importer who makes equipment available on the market. So we will supply products to a distributor, for example, in Norway, and they are the local distributor who makes the product available. Now, under EU legislation, all economic operators have specified obligations, and it's worthwhile, for our distributors to be familiar with the legislation, and you'll find that there's a section within the directive or the regulation which specifies the obligations of all of the economic operators, including the distributor. And for the distributor, that will include, for example, checking that the manufacturer has drawn up a declaration of conformity. And also, if there was ever to be a serious incident related to product safety, that you inform the manufacturer, and even in some cases, inform your local authorities. So, for example, in the UK, we have the Health and Safety Executive, who is responsible for health and safety at work. So if there was an incident at work, they would often be involved. So that gives you some background about legislation in general. So now what I want to do is just focus more specifically on medical device legislation. And as you can now imagine, the purpose of the legislation is to ensure both the safety but also the efficacy of medical devices, to make sure that they are not only safe for the patient, but also maybe the nurses and the doctors that are using the equipment, and also that any claims by the manufacturer about its use and efficiency is confirmed as well. The definition of a medical device is any product intended by the manufacturer to be used for human beings for a specific medical purpose. And to illustrate why I've highlighted the words intended and medical purpose, you could take the example of, let's say, a pair of scissors. A manufacturer can produce scissors for just general use, and in that case, it's not a medical device. But those very same scissors could be marketed by the manufacturer for a specific medical purpose. So, for example, for cutting bandages or for use in an operating theatre type setting. So there, the manufacturer has declared a specific medical use for the product. And that's what defines a medical device. It's really up to the manufacturer in that case to decide. So in terms of the legislation, there is the current Medical Device Directive, which I'm sure most of you are very familiar with the number 9342 EEC. And as you can see, that's a directive. So it's been up to individual countries to implement the laws themselves to achieve the objectives of the directive. This is now being replaced by the Medical Device Regulation 2017-745. And as you can see, we're now talking about a regulation. So this will apply equally and immediately across the whole of the European Union in the same way. And obviously that has real advantages in terms of consistency of legislation, but also reporting and transparency across the whole of the EU market. So let's talk a little bit more about the new regulation. So this became effective, will become effective rather, on the 26th of May 2021. It was intended to be introduced become effective on the 26th of May this year, but because of the COVID-19 pandemic, the EU authorities recognized that many manufacturers and notified bodies were focusing a lot on supporting the efforts to combat the pandemic. So many of you may have heard about the rush there was early on to introduce and develop new ventilators. So manufacturers and particularly the notified bodies were very focused on supporting that effort. So the EU have delayed the effective date until the 26th of May next year. The regulation, or the MDR as we'll call it, will progressively replace the existing directive, the MDD. In fact, the new regulation is already in force, which allows manufacturers to start with all the preparations for when it becomes fully effective. And maybe the next thing to consider is, why has the European Union made this change from a directive to a regulation. And the main driving reason for this was the recent scandal related to the PIP breast implant scandal, where inferior quality breast implants were being routinely implanted, whilst there was still a lot of evidence across the market that these were not of good quality or acceptable quality. So the European Union realized that the current legislation under the directive was simply not doing its job properly, and there was an urgent need to update it, and that's the reason for the new regulation. So as you can now imagine, this new legislation contains a series of improvements to ensure better protection for public health and for patients. Safety. And the underlying objectives are to ensure there is improvement in the quality and safety and reliability of medical devices. That seems clear. But also to strengthen transparency of information. So as I mentioned, under the directive, there were different rules in different countries about how medical devices are registered, if at all, depending on their classification. And there wasn't a shared database which would allow information to be communicated effectively between the different competent authorities across Europe. So the competent authority is the national organization responsible for enforcing the safety of medical devices. The other thing was that there was a lot of complaints leveled at the notified bodies and also the manufacturers in not reporting issues in a timely way to the authorities. So there's also a need to enhance what we call vigilance and market surveillance, which is the way in which information about defects or incidents is fed back to the manufacturer so that they can take corrective actions and where necessary to inform the authorities. So there was the need to really strengthen the legislation in these different areas. As a result of all this, the regulation introduces quite some significant changes for manufacturers and their European authorized representative. So this includes, for example, much stricter conformity assessments, ensuring that the products are safe and safe to use. So this covers areas like product testing, checking the translated instructions for use, and clinical evaluation. So just to elaborate a little bit more on this, whereas in the past it was acceptable for manufacturers to do critical product testing in-house, now that work needs to be done by accredited laboratories. So as you can imagine, that has implications for timescales and also for costs. With regard to translated instructions for use, and I realize that this is a topical issue, before we can place a product on the market, not only do the instructions have to be in languages that can be understood by the users, those translations have to be submitted as part of the technical file to the notified bodies for approval before that product is placed on the market. So as you can imagine, that has implications as well. And the other important area is if you're claiming that this product is suitable for medical use, it needs to be supported by clinical evaluation. That means that before we can state that a product is like a for timescales and also for costs. With regard to translated instructions for use, and I realise that this is a topical issue, before we can place a product on the market, not only do the instructions have to be in languages that can be understood by the users, those translations have to be submitted as part of the technical file to the notified bodies for approval before that product is placed on the market. So as you can imagine, that has implications as well. And the other important area is if you're claiming that this product is suitable for medical use, it needs to be supported by clinical evaluation. That means that before we can state that a product is like a CO2 incubator is suitable for a particular purpose, there has to be clinical evidence and evaluation to support that claim. So as you can imagine, that also involves a lot of effort to achieve. As well as that, manufacturers and authorised representatives have to update their quality management systems, review, for example, their procedures for vigilance and market surveillance to ensure that it meets the requirements of the new regulation. As I mentioned, the notified bodies came under a lot of criticism, so they're under a lot more pressure to conduct much more strict audits of manufacturers going forward. To support with the transparency and sharing of information, there will be a new pan-European database called UDAMED, and all companies and products will need to be registered in it so that information is easily accessible across the whole of the EU. One of the other changes is that organisations such as PHC Europe, in our role as authorised representative, we have to appoint, and this is an official position, a qualified person responsible for regulatory affairs who has certain qualifications. So it's not just the case of asking somebody to do the job, they actually have to have certain qualifications to do it. So as you can see, that's some of the background to the regulation. So let's talk a little bit more about timescales and how it affects PHC. Europe. So as I mentioned, the regulation already entered into force back in 2017. The idea is that this gives manufacturers time to adjust and adapt to the new legislation. It becomes effective from the 26th of May next year. And there are transitional provisions in the regulation that give manufacturers further time to prepare their products for the new regulation. So those transitional provisions end in 2024. They are not delayed, so they stay the same. And what it means is that certificates issued by notified bodies under the directive after the 25th of May 2017 will remain valid until that certificate expires. However, they will become void at the latest on the 20th. You can imagine that has implications for timescales and also for costs. With regard to translated instructions for use, and I realise that this is a topical issue, before we can place a product on the market, not only do the instructions have to be in languages that can be understood by the users, those translations have to be submitted as part of the technical file to the notified bodies for approval before that product is placed on the market. So as you can imagine, that has implications as well. And the other important area is if you're claiming that this product is suitable for medical use, it needs to be supported by clinical evaluation. That means that before we can state that a product is like a CO2 incubator is suitable for a particular purpose, there has to be clinical evidence and evaluation to support that claim. So as you can imagine, that also involves a lot of effort to achieve. As well as that, manufacturers and authorized representatives have to update their quality management systems, review, for example, their procedures for vigilance and market surveillance to ensure that it meets the requirements of the new regulation. As I mentioned, the notified bodies came under a lot of criticism, so they're under a lot more pressure to conduct much more strict audits of manufacturers going forward. To support with the transparency and sharing of information, there will be a new pan-European database called UDAMED, and all companies and products will need to be registered in it so that information is easily accessible across the whole of the EU. One of the other changes is that organizations such as PHC Europe, in our role as authorized representative, we have to appoint, and this is an official position, a qualified person responsible for regulatory affairs who has certain qualifications. So it's not just the case of asking somebody to do the job, they actually have to have certain qualifications to do it. So as you can see, that's some of the background to the regulation. So let's talk a little bit more about timescales and how it affects PHC Europe. So as I mentioned, the regulation already entered into force back in 2017. The idea is that this gives manufacturers time to adjust and adapt to the new legislation. It becomes effective from the 26th of May next year. And there are transitional provisions in the regulation that give manufacturers further time to prepare their products for the new regulation. So those transitional provisions end in 2024. They are not delayed, so they stay the same. And what it means is that certificates issued by notified bodies under the directive after the 25th of May 2017 will remain valid until that certificate expires. However, they will become void at the latest on the 27th of May 2024. So what does that mean for our products? What it means is that even after the 26th of May 2021, we will still be placing products on the market under the directive. And that might be something that we need to be aware of, because customers may be thinking that the product should be complying with the regulation at that point. That is not the case. The manufacturer has to work to the new regulation, but it can still place products on the market who have, or which have rather, valid certification under the directive. So that's something to be aware of when we get to that point. Also, the newer regulation understands that there's always products in the supply chain and that you can't just stop on a certain date under the old directive. That would mean having to throw away perfectly good products unnecessarily, and that's obviously not desirable. So in fact, we have until the 27th of May 2025 to sell out all of the products in the supply chain that had valid certification under the directive. That's obviously still a long way off, and I'm sure that will not be an issue. Right, so let's look at our strategy for medical devices. I would like to start out by saying that we've obviously communicated already to all of our staff and to our distributors on how these changes affect them individually. So it will affect distributors differently depending on the country. That has been communicated to you, and obviously if you have any specific questions, then I would ask that you email me that separately after this session. So basically, considering the organizational impact and investment required to achieve and maintain conformity with this new regulation, it was appropriate that PHC reviews its strategies, because obviously the implications were actually quite severe. And we know from discussions with others in the marketplace that we're not the only company that will be thinking about this. And obviously there is actually a 4-year, well, there was a 4-year, it's now a 3-year transition period for which companies may be thinking about it. So if they're not doing it now, they will, may well be doing it in the coming months and years. So as a result of this review, we have decided to reduce the number of models which will eventually be placed on the market as medical devices. We wanted to retain some capability in this area and give us some flexibility going forward, depending on how the market changes and also how the regulatory requirements change. We have had to make the difficult decision to reduce the number of countries on which products are placed as medical devices. And because of the preparations needed, we had already been in a position where those changes will take effect from the 26th of May this year, even though the implementation, as you know, is now delayed by a year. We couldn't readjust in the time available. It happened at very short notice. So our plans stay as they were. So whilst we're making these changes, it's also very important to understand and to point out that these medical device products, which will be no longer placed on the market as medical devices and in the countries affected, will still be available. We will just change the regulatory status of those products to laboratory use and under the low voltage directive. So essentially our product lineup stays the same. It's just that the regulatory status of some of the models will change, and obviously it will affect certain countries more than others. But the bottom line is that the product lineup stays the same. So our expectation is that the impact will be actually very small. The only exception to this are the blood bank refrigerators, which only have a medical purpose in terms of storing blood. Yeah? And we'll talk more about that as we finish the presentation. So let's go in a bit more detail as to how this affects our product lineup and our current medical device models. So as I mentioned, we're going to ultimately restrict the number of models placed on the market as medical devices. So 9 of our current models, which are listed here, will transition as medical devices from the directive to the regulation in 16 countries only, and to laboratory use in all countries. The only exception to that is the blood bank refrigerators, as I have mentioned, because they only have a medical purpose. So these are the 9 models that will transition to the new medical device regulation. So in terms of timelines and developments, up until the 26th of May this year, and bearing in mind that we are sticking to our original plan, those 9 models were available as medical devices in all 33 countries. So we're looking here at the European Union, but also countries of the European Economic Area, Switzerland and Turkey. After the 26th of May this year, and that essentially relates to April production in the factory, we will continue to offer these products as medical devices in the 16 countries, and I've communicated with the countries involved, so you should know who you are. During the 4-year transition period, these models will be updated, let's say, and will be certified under the new regulation. This will take time, and it will vary from model to model as PHC complete the conformity assessments. So for the time being, all of these models will continue to have a declaration of conformity according to the directive. And when that conformity assessment is completed under the regulation, the declarations of conformity will be updated accordingly. And then after the 26th of May 2024, all of those products will be declared under the new regulation for those 16 countries. For all countries, including the countries where we continue with medical devices, we will simultaneously declare the products for laboratory use or research use under the low voltage directive. So that change comes into effect straight away and will continue after the transition period ends in 2024. And I'd just like to highlight we've still got the same exception which applies to the blood bank refrigerators, and they can only be sold in the 16 countries now, and we've discontinued them from the other 17 countries. So that's the first batch of models that will transition to the new regulation. We then have the other 14 medical device models which will not be transitioned to the medical device regulation and will be placed on the market under the low voltage directive for laboratory use. So they're all listed here, and in fact, as we've just announced, the 55V is discontinued, and obviously the 900V is being replaced by the new 901 VHL, which is for laboratory use only at this point. Okay, so in terms of timelines here, it's a similar situation. We have up to the 26th of May 2020. We've been marketing all of those products in Group 2 under the directive in 33 countries. From the 26th of May this year, in the 16 countries only, that current medical device certification remains valid and can remain in place until the 26th of May 2024. So even though we will eventually discontinue these models of medical devices, throughout the transition period up to the end of May 2024, they're still available in the 16 countries as medical devices. I hope that is clear. And then for all countries concerned, we will simultaneously declare the products for laboratory research use under the low voltage directive. So again, what it means that all of our products, with the exception of the blood bank refrigerators, remain available to everybody, and it's only the regulatory status that is changing. Okay, I hope that's clear, and obviously we'll pick up any questions at the end of this session, or if necessary, we can answer them separately. By all means, send us an email and we'll do our best to answer them as soon as possible. The other areas that I want to look at relate to intended use and labelling. So under intended use, the manufacturer is required to state the intended use of a medical device in the instructions for use. This intended medical use must be supported by clinical evidence, and furthermore, following guidance that we've received from TÜV-SÜD, we should also include the temperature and duration of storage or cultivation, depending on whether it's a freezer or an incubator. And this updated intended use information will be introduced from April 2020 production, and you'll start to see it in the updated instructions for use. So let's look at this in a bit more detail. So this table here shows the intended use of the different product categories that are used for the medical devices. So if, for example, we take the biomedical freezers, the current intended use or the past intended use has been that this equipment is designed for low temperature storage of DNA and plasma. What we're now required to do is to be much more specific in terms of the intended medical use. So this intended use has been updated based on available clinical evaluation or clinical data. So, for example, in terms of blood and blood product storage, the European Union issues guidelines on storage temperatures and storage times for different types of blood components. So there we have a ready source of available clinical data. So in respect to plasma, that can be stored or can be stored below -25 degrees C for up to 3 years. So that's the intended use for the biomedical freezers in relation to the storage of plasma. Similarly, we've had to undertake extensive investigations to establish clinical use for the other product lines. So, for example, for the CO2 incubators, you have IVF procedures that we can refer to. So these are the ones that we have specified, and these will appear in the instructions for use. These intended uses have to be part of our submission to the notified body. So going forward, if there was a new medical development and there was a clear medical use that we could use our products for, then that medical use could be incorporated within the intended use, but it has to be based on evidence, and it would have to be submitted and approved by the notified body before we could change or update the intended use of the product. And as I mentioned, that intended use now will appear in the instructions for use along with other relevant application information. The other aspect that will change is in relation to labeling. Labeling is a big element of the Medical Device Directive and regulation. It's a way in which we inform users about the status of the product and who to contact in the event of an issue. So from April 2020 production, the labeling, i.e. the nameplate that actually is stuck to the product, will be updated. And that shows the changed regulatory status of the products. So for the applicable countries, it shows the medical use certification, CE mark, and also for the laboratory use as well. The other elements to the labeling include the manufacturer. So this is the recognized symbol for the manufacturer, PHC Corporation, and also for the EC rep, which is PHC Europe BV, and also the importer. So the user knows who they can contact if there is some incident they want to report. Okay. And obviously in the case of the blood bank refrigerators, there's no reference here for laboratory use. So these new labeling elements will start to appear as we bring in the new stock from last month. As well as the product labeling, we're also updating the packaging label, because that also has to communicate to the customers and to the authorities the regulatory status of the product. So essentially you see the same elements that we just discussed on the packaging label as well. And if we have any distributors tuning in from Russia and the other countries of the Eurasian Economic Union, you can see that where applicable, we also now apply the EAC label for that particular regulatory network. Right, okay, so that's the labeling. Similarly, we will be updating the marketing. This will be a gradual process. We have a little bit more leeway as a manufacturer now because of the delay, but from May this year, we've started to update the marketing material, and obviously we've requested the distributors concerned to update their marketing as soon as they can, and that's being communicated separately. Right, okay, so I think the last sort of area to look at is the new declarations of conformity for the medical devices. So as I mentioned, the regulatory status of our medical devices is changing, and we are declaring the products both for medical use under the directive, but also for other purposes under the low voltage directive. So we will now have 2 declarations of conformity for each product, and it's up to everybody to use and provide the appropriate declaration of conformity. So essentially, if you're in an applicable country where the medical devices are continuing and there is a need to have a medical use product, then it would be appropriate to provide the declaration of conformity to the medical device directive. For all other purposes or other general purposes, I recommend that you provide the low voltage directive declaration of conformity. Both of these will be uploaded to our product portal. Again, the exception will be the blood bank refrigerators, where there will only be a declaration of conformity under the directive. So as mentioned, these will be uploaded to the product portal when inventory transitions to the new regulatory status. So just to provide some information about that, we started to bring product under this new regulatory status into the EU from May, June onwards. Obviously, we have stock in the warehouse, and that stock will gradually work its way through the system. And when it's appropriate to do so, we will update the product portal with the new declarations of conformity. So this is what they will look like. So for each product, so this is an example for these are the declarations of conformity for the MDF DU 702VH. As I've mentioned before, it specifies the manufacturer, the identity of the product, and the serial number from which this change is applying from. The medical device declaration of conformity refers to the directive and the notified body, and the low voltage directive declaration refers to the directives, not only the low voltage, but also the EMC directive and the Roche directive, and the applicable harmonized standards that we have used. The only other thing really to point out is that the date or year from which the CE marking was firstly affixed, which is another requirement of the directives, is that for the medical device, obviously we've had this product on the market as a medical device already, so that goes back to 2017 when the product was first launched. But in respect to the low voltage directive, we are applying the CE marking for the first time in 2020. So that's why you see that difference in the dates. Right, okay, that's it. So thank you very much for taking part and for listening throughout this presentation. So we'll now check whether there are any questions. Right, so I see that we've got 3 questions, which I'll do my best to answer. So first question is, can authorized representatives can authorized representatives and importer to be different entities? Yes, they can be different entities. So in the case of PHC, obviously because they have a legal entity within the European Union, which is PHC Europe BV, it was very convenient for them to appoint us as the authorized representative. We know the products. It's obviously much easier for us to communicate with PHC in Japan, and we can be both the authorized representative and the importer. That's not always the case, so I'm sure it's not a problem if I give the example of Customs Biogenic Systems, or CBS, which we also sell. The manufacturer is based in the United States of America. They have to appoint an authorized representative in the EU, but they don't have a legal entity. They don't have a subsidiary in the European Union. So they've appointed another company called Emergo as their authorized representative. I think that's answered that first question. Next question. Will there be a transition period between the directive and the regulation, or immediately after becoming effective on the 26th of May 2021? So as I mentioned, it's a good question. Yes, there is a transition period because these things always take time for manufacturers to adjust and to have their products certified under the new regulation. So yes, there is a transition period. So the new regulation becomes effective on the 26th of May 2021, and the transition period ends on the 26th of May 2024. So as long as products have valid certification under the directive, they can still be sold on them during that transition period. In fact, as I mentioned, they can also be sold up to 2025. So that 2024 deadline relates to when products can be placed on the EU market for the first time. So we can't bring any more products into the EU after that date. And then between 2024 and 2025, we can still, and the distributors can still sell out products from their warehouses, from their stocks that is certified under the directive. So actually there's a long period for us to work through this process. The next question also is, can you sell products after the 26th of May 2021 without the medical device directive? Yes, yes, you can sell after that date if you still only have the medical device certification for that product. So again, hopefully that helps. Why some countries are out of medical device regulation? This will cause a problem at customs. Right, okay, I think if I understand the question correctly, the products are carrying dual regulatory status under the directive, medical device directive, and also under the low voltage directive. We can place the products on the EU market. They carry the necessary certification at the point that they enter the EU. They're within free circulation. We can then determine at that point that we will then only place certain products on the market for medical use in particular countries within the EU. So that's a decision that we are taking, and that's been agreed and approved with our notified body. So it won't cause a problem with customs because the products can still be brought into the Union under that low voltage declaration for laboratory research use. So again, I hope that answers that question. Right, good, all right. They're the published questions. If you have any other further questions, by all means send them in by email and we'll do our best to answer them as soon as we can. There's no other questions on the board and we're getting close to the end of the hour, so I think we can wrap it up at this point. So thank you very much for joining and for listening. And I know we've got another presentation lined up for everybody next week, so I don't know, Jan, do you want to cut in and tell us about that?
Yes, Paul, thank you very much. Next week we will have another session, and let me just quickly check what it will be.
Sorry for putting you on the spot.
No problem. I just have to check my mailbox, so I have to the correct topic. Let me just quickly check this. Okay, so next week on June 25th, at 11 o'clock, we will do an online product training about hybrid water cooling for the EcoFit ULT freezers and cryogenic freezers, as well as we will do a short product presentation about the new MCO 170 AC and the MDF-DU 901 VHL new ULT freezer. And then on July 9th, we will do a cryogenic equipment presentation about custom biogenic systems. So we will present all their cryogenic equipment, which includes the isothermal freezers, and it includes the control rate freezers they sell, and we sell as well. And that will be the last online product training on July 9th before the summer holidays starts. So we will stop doing online product training from that date onwards, and most likely we'll start again at the end of August or beginning of September with new online product training. Okay. Paul, I don't know if you have anything to add.
No, that's great. So I think we can wrap up there.
Yeah.
Thank you everybody for joining.
Yeah, thank you very much. A copy of the presentation is added to the product portal right now. So you can read it afterwards. And if you have any questions, then please send them in by email. You can send them to me or directly to Paul, and then we will follow them up by email. Thank you very much for attending, and we wish you a very pleasant day. Bye-bye.